an unexpected naval armada in the southern Caribbean, a $50 million U.S. bounty for a sitting president, a leader promising a republic in arms if foreign forces attack. Welcome to the new flashpoint in the Americas, the U.S.-Venezuela crisis. But beneath the headlines lie complicated motives, operational constraints, and cascading global risks. In this video, we'll trace the full story, from the strategic calculus in Washington to the military realities in Caracas, to the worst-case scenarios no one wants to talk about. This is Talk Maniac. Let's begin. In late August and early September 2025, the United States moved a substantial naval presence into the southern Caribbean. Washington described the deployment as part of an intensified anti-drug campaign. At the same time, the U.S. government doubled its reward for information leading to the arrest of President Nicolas Maduro, raising the offer to $50 million. Caracas immediately accused Washington of preparing for regime change. Maduro warned that any attack would trigger a republic in arms, mass mobilization of militia and defensive forces. These are big moves, but headlines compress motive, risk, and capability into dramatic sound bites. To evaluate whether the U.S. would or could attack, we must unpack history, law, military reality, and regional politics. Venezuela's modern crisis is decades in the making. Under Hugo Chavez and then Nicolas Maduro, the state restructured around oil revenues, patrimonial politics, and a security apparatus fused with political power. U.S.-Venezuela relations oscillated through this era, cooperation on energy and then a deep rupture after Chavez's Bolivarian politics and antagonism with Washington. Sanctions, diplomatic expulsions, and mutual accusations became routine. The 2010s and early 2020s saw economic collapse, dramatic declines in oil production, hyperinflation, and mass migration. Yet the regime retained core levers of power: the military, patronage networks, and a mobilized political base. By mid-2025, Caracas had solidified closer ties with geopolitical competitors of the U.S., notably Russia, including strategic agreements, energy cooperation, and military technical ties. Those ties are central when assessing the risk calculus of any kinetic episode. Officially, Washington frames the operation as an offensive against regional drug trafficking networks. The White House argues that criminal networks and corrupt officials driven by the Venezuelan state have destabilized the hemisphere for years, contributing to a fentanyl and cocaine crisis spilling into the U.S. Doubling the reward for Maduro's arrest to $50 million is framed as accountability for narcotics-related transnational crime. But the geography is awkward. Much of the cocaine flow to the U.S. routes through the Pacific or via overland air corridors, not necessarily the southern Caribbean where the naval buildup is concentrated. That discrepancy fuels two interpretations. Either the U.S. is using anti-drug law enforcement as cover for a coercive push on Caracas, or the deployment is intended as a forward deterrent, to interdict shipments and to posture politically. Either way, deployment of major naval and amphibious assets signals willingness to escalate if Washington deems it necessary. Let's get granular. What could the U.S. do militarily, and what would those options actually cost? Precision air or naval strikes on command nodes, radar, and limited facilities, or special forces raids to capture named individuals. These can be executed with relatively small forces and plausible deniability about broader occupation. But they carry high political and escalation risk if civilian casualties or mistargeting occur. An extended naval posture enforcing inspections, stopping shipments, and interdicting vessels could squeeze regime finances and narco networks, while avoiding ground occupation. But blockades raise legal issues and can cause humanitarian pressure and massive regional protest. Logistically enormous. Venezuela is big, urbanized, and politically fractious. Occupation implies thousands of troops, long supply lines, urban stabilization operations, and high casualty and fiscal costs, not a politically credible option for many U.S. administrations. Venezuela fields Russian-supplied long-range S-300 family SAMs, including variants that present serious risks to aircraft in contested airspace, coastal anti-ship missiles, Su-30 fighter jets on paper, and sizable paramilitary militias created during the Bolivarian era. Those layers increase the risk that limited strikes could escalate quickly or that U.S. platforms could be targeted. So militarily, the U.S. has options, but none are cost-free. Air superiority and naval power give the U.S. the ability to conduct decisive strikes, yet anti-access/area denial systems, coastal missiles, and militia actions complicate operations, increase danger to U.S. personnel, and raise the odds of wider conflict. Military feasibility is only one side. Political authority, legal justification, and domestic appetite matter enormously. A unilateral invasion would likely face deep political questions in the U.S. Congress and a polarized public. A president can order strikes or deployments, but sustained occupation without congressional authorization would be politically explosive. The U.S. would need a legal framing, UN Security Council authorization, unlikely given Russian-Chinese posture, or self-defense counter-terrorism arguments. Legal thinness undermines international legitimacy and risks diplomatic isolation. U.S. policymakers must weigh the costs against other crises, electoral politics, and the risk of open-ended commitment reminiscent of past occupations. Those constraints push decision-makers toward coercion short of occupation. In short, the political tail often wags the military dog. That's why the most credible near-term U.S. pathways emphasize coercion, interdiction, and legal pressure rather than invasion. An armed clash off Venezuela would ripple across the hemisphere. Venezuela has already produced one of the largest refugee flows in the world. Conflict would intensify displacement to Colombia, Brazil, Caribbean islands, and eventually toward Central America and the U.S., straining services and fueling political backlash across the region. Latin American governments range from quietly supportive of U.S. pressure to openly critical of interventionism. A U.S. kinetic operation risks alienating allies and strengthening anti-U.S. narratives among swing governments. Russia, China, and Iran would react, probably not with open war, but with diplomatic condemnations, sanctions, countermeasures, expanded military technical support, and ways to complicate U.S. regional policy. That would raise geopolitical friction in what has historically been a U.S.-dominated hemisphere. Even though Venezuelan oil production is far below past peaks, the symbolism and risk premium matter. Markets react to uncertainty. Regional shipping routes, insurance costs, and worries about supply disruption could nudge prices higher. Secondary economic fallout, sanctions, disrupted trade, and investor flight would also deepen a Venezuelan economic collapse and complicate humanitarian response. These economic pressures would amplify migration and instability. Let's model 4 plausible pathways, estimate their likelihood, and list practical consequences. Coercive pressure and maritime interdiction, most likely approximately 40–50%. Extended naval presence, interdictions, and tougher sanctions aimed at choking narco networks and pressuring security elites to defect. Consequences: elevated tensions, migration spikes, diplomatic fallout, but no occupation. Targeted kinetic raids or strikes, plausible, approximately 25–30%. Limited strikes on specific facilities or special forces raids to capture key leaders or networks. Consequences: short-term blows to regime capabilities but high escalation risk, potential civilian casualties, and regional backlash. No kinetic action, intensified sanctions and covert pressure, likely if domestic political costs rise, approximately 15–25%. Diplomacy, sanctions, financial targeting, clandestine support for opposition. Consequences: prolonged stalemate, humanitarian deterioration, and the possibility of deeper Russian-Chinese economic entanglement with Caracas. Full-scale invasion occupation, unlikely but catastrophic if attempted, approximately 5–10%. Massive costs, occupation quagmire, insurgency, long-term regional destabilization. Historical analogs advise extreme caution. These are not forecasts with certainty, but structured probabilities to guide thinking about risk and policy. Any kinetic campaign will deepen human suffering, casualties, displacement, and shortages of medicine and food. The moral calculus is stark. Proponents argue that removing a predatory regime could save lives long-term. Opponents warn that external military action often produces more immediate civilian harm and long, fractious occupations. A serious policy should prioritize humanitarian corridors, neutral aid access, and multilateral guarantees, none of which are cheap or easy. If the objective is to reduce narcotics trafficking, stem human suffering, and restore legitimate governance, the policy mix should include multilateral pressure and clear legal framing. Seek regional buy-in to avoid the perception of unilateral coercion. Smart interdiction with strong safeguards. Prioritize intelligence-led actions that minimize civilian harm and avoid open occupation. Humanitarian planning ahead of kinetic options. Preposition aid, negotiate safe corridors, and commit multilateral funding for refugees. Strategic patience. Combine long-term economic levers with targeted law enforcement action and robust diplomatic channels to pursue defections within the security apparatus. The U.S.-Venezuela crisis is a complex knot of drugs, diplomacy, military capability, and humanitarian risk. The United States has tools to coerce, but history shows that hard power without political legitimacy can create a worse mess than the original problem. The most probable path forward is coercive pressure short of occupation, but limited strikes remain possible, and each step carries the risk of regional destabilization. For viewers, watch naval movements, official legal statements, and migration numbers. Those will tell you whether the crisis is cooling into pressure or igniting into conflict. If you found this useful, like, subscribe, and share.